I'm going to start today by reading an opening statement that I have that will take us from where we ended last week into where we're at today. And it says this: For generations, many of God's people had been easily bowing to other gods. But while in exile, some would only worship the true God of Israel, no matter the cost. And the presence of God that departed the temple showed up in their midst. Um, those of you that are joining us for the first time, I'll just bring you up to speed a little bit. Over the last several weeks, we've been going through the Bible and pulling out some of the more famous passages, some of the more famous people that have a dramatic uh, story that we even use as bedtime stories for our kids. David and Goliath, Noah, and all of the notable things. We've started from the beginning and gone through. And the key that I've been trying to unlock in all of these stories that I've heard all of my life is that there was a God behind these stories that was more important than the hero that we all know and love. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't uh, be inspired by all of these different people: King David, King Solomon, um, Ruth, all of these different people in the Bible that have notable stories that are inspirational and aspirational as far as us taking things from their lives and what they accomplished for God and trying to pattern ourselves after it. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with any of that, but the point of this series is to look at the story behind the story that actually fleshes out the story of God and mankind all the way from the beginning up until when Jesus came and finally restored relationship of man with God. Um, there's a thread that goes throughout the Bible of God trying to lead these people and be with these people, to dwell with these people. And there was also a common thread of why God ultimately had to remove himself from their presence, remove himself from the temple, and remove the children of Israel from the promised land because they were worshiping other gods. And like I said in that opening statement, generation after generation, God was faithful and man was unfaithful and started worshiping other gods. And that was the thing that God hated the most, was the fact that they worshiped other gods and they would not prioritize God over these other things or sometimes people. And that's what led us to this part of the story with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, where finally somebody makes the decision that God was after all along. And I will say that before we can discuss Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we must first address the story of Daniel. Daniel in the Bible introduces us to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And ultimately, there's another story about Daniel that we will get into more detail next week, and how he faced this same challenge of, now, for the first time, they were faced with a ruler over them that demanded that they serve another God. The difference with the other children of Israel all throughout this time is they just outright chose to worship other gods, to make idols and make golden calves and all of the different things that they struggle with throughout generations of people that God was trying to lead and trying to dwell with. Uh, this is the first time, really, that they were subject to other leadership and rulers that forced them to make a decision. That's one of the things that happened in this season. It forced allegiance one way or another. And that's what we're going to talk about with these three men. But first, let's talk about uh, how they came to the place where they were faced with this decision to begin with. And it starts in Daniel, and it starts in chapter 1. I'm going to just start reading it a little bit, and then we'll dissect it as we go. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia, and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered the chief of his court officials to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. So that's why I want to pause to start here. I've overlooked this part of the story most of my life, and listening to these stories all my life, I didn't really. Maybe I've heard it, but it never really stood out to me that the first thing that happened when this exile happened, when they were taken from the promised land and brought into this other land under another ruler, under another king, the first thing that he did with these four guys was to change their name, to try to uproot any allegiance they had to their own gods, to their own place, and redirect that to where they were at now. So he changed their names. And that's the first thing that they had to face was we're not our own anymore. We are in a foreign land and we have to adapt to their rules. And at least that's what's being required, is to adapt to their rules, down to changing our names. And I can't even imagine what that must have been like to have somebody change your name for their benefit. And mostly the reason for it was to take away their allegiance to God. But their names changed, but not their character. They could change their name, but they couldn't change what was on the inside. They had no control over that. They could try to manipulate it, they could try to force it, but what was on the inside of them, that was a decision that was up to them alone. So now we're going to keep reading. And Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. This happened because the king, they had to eat certain foods, the royal food and wine, and that was a requirement. And part of this 3 years that they were supposed to serve before they actually really served the king, but this was one of the first tests. And so he didn't want to eat the royal food because it would defile themselves from their own God. The things that God told them that they could and couldn't eat, they didn't want to do that. So he had to negotiate with this official. Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat from royal food, and treat your servants in accordance to with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these four young men, God gave knowledge and understanding in all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, so they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Daniel found favor after interpreting King Nebuchadnezzar's dream and took his friends with him into leadership. At that time, we're not going to go into the details of that, but the king was basically tormented by these dreams, and nobody could interpret it and let him know what was happening. Daniel was able to see and predict and to articulate in great detail what was happening with the king. And because of that, I'm grossly over just going over what happened there. You should read it in detail for yourself. But Daniel found favor because of that, and because of that, that propelled his friends into favor too. So I'm going to keep reading. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell prostrate before Daniel and paid him honor and ordered that an offering and incense be presented to him. The king said to Daniel, "Surely your God is the God of gods and the Lord of kings and the revealer of mysteries, for you were able to reveal this mystery." Then the king placed Daniel in a high position and lavished many gifts on him. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon and placed him in charge of all its wise men. Moreover, at Daniel's request, the king appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego administrators over the province of Babylon, while Daniel himself remained at the royal court. So this is a promotion in exile, in captivity, much like what happened with Joseph, how he rose up into positions of authority while being held captive. This happened with all four of these men. And so now this sets us up to talk about the famous story that happened with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And we needed to talk about how it happened, and it happened through Daniel. Again, now these men are being faced with something that didn't even happen to some of the other prophets, even Isaiah or Jeremiah or Ezekiel. They didn't face this situation where it was you had to decide if you're going to choose our God or his God, and there's no in between. You choose one or the other. And up until this point, the children of Israel, it showed through their actions that they would choose the other gods over and over again, even King Solomon. So this was a test in exile. Are the children of Israel going to advance under pressure, or are they going to sink under pressure and fall even further into wrong habits and wrong attitudes and wrong uh, actions and their position with the God? This was going to bring to the forefront what was going to happen, what they were really made of. So at this point, the king demands that they worship this image of gold, that everyone had to worship this image of gold. Let's pick up here in chapter 3, Daniel chapter 3, verse 12. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These are people that were basically tattling on them, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold you have set up. And so at this point, the king demands an explanation from them. And this is the part of where the rubber meets the road. And I call it the "but if he doesn't" type of faith. And so at verse 16, it says, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. So at this point, the king turns up the heat. And this it says in verse 19, then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude toward them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual and commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. Now I want to read a portion of a book that I read. It's a introduction and commentary about Daniel by Joyce G. Baldwin. And it says, Justice demanded that the 3 men should not be condemned on hearsay alone, and therefore, despite his furious rage, Nebuchadnezzar gave them opportunity to recant. It was imperative that the great king should not lose face before the magnificent array of international delegates, and he defied any god to deliver them from the hands of his Babylonian majesty. This shows human pride taken to its logical conclusion, saying, Thou shalt have no other god but me. There is nothing the 3 can say in their own defense. They are technically guilty, but they have also been misrepresented. All they can do is cast themselves on their God with the king whom the king has defied. They don't doubt the power of their God to deliver them from the king's furnace, but they have no right to presume that he will do so. If he does not, they are ready to take the consequences rather than the compromise on such a contrived issue. Again, this was a test of all tests to not only choose to trust God, but also to throw in there that even if he doesn't, even if he doesn't deliver us, we're not going to worship this image of gold. Do whatever you want with us, but we will not do that. And my question is like, I'll get into it and more in a little bit, but where was this kind of allegiance in the wilderness? Where was this type of allegiance after King Solomon died and the North went to complete craziness, worshiping anything but the true God? And a lot of the South Kingdom, the same thing. It's some good kings, some bad kings, some okay kings. Um, but all of it led to something that God had to do, which is what he promised. If you don't keep up your end of this covenant, I will remove you and I will remove myself from you. And he finally had to make good on what he was promised, what he had promised. And that's exactly what he did. And that's how these people end up in captivity in Babylon to begin with, is because they would not worship the true God. But these men are different. And my question is, What's changed? What's the difference? Why were they so dug in on worshiping a God that their ancestors refused to completely surrender to? That's a good question because eventually we have to ask the question of ourselves. Let me continue. But God showed up in the furnace. The presence of God showed up in the furnace. And that's the I don't know if it's alarming or surprising thing, but it's the powerful thing that God showed up. This is the presence of God that left the temple, like we talked about last week in Ezekiel, the vision that he was allowed to see of the glory leaving the temple and shifting, moving out away from his people and the place where he promised that he would dwell with them. He left it. But there's something about what happened in that furnace that brought the presence of God in. And he entered and they were not touched. You know the whole story. And so they weren't harmed at all. And then here in verse 28, then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted him and defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any God except their own God. Therefore, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be burned into piles of rubble. For no other God can save in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the province of Babylon. That leads me to a question of what about us today? Generations after generations after generations later, we as God's people, what are we willing to give up for our allegiance to Him? Where are we today on this side of the cross? Are there conditions to our allegiance to God? What are they? Why are they? That phrase buried in the middle of that passage. But even if he doesn't, we still will not worship this image of gold. We're still not going to serve any God but our God because our God is God. That kind of resolute, willing to risk it all, to lay it all down, willing to burn when you're faced with a choice of, well, are you going to serve me or die, and to choose the path of, I believe our God can and I believe he will rescue us. But they didn't have to put that part in there. They didn't have to say that. That didn't have to be recorded in the middle of this passage. But even if he doesn't, and I wonder, I don't wonder it just for you, I wonder it for me. Do I have that even if he doesn't kind of faith? Even if I don't get the breakthrough, even if I don't get the miracle, even if I don't get the healing, even if I don't get the provision that my family so desperately needs, even if he doesn't, will I still serve him with my whole heart? Will I still completely surrender? Will I still give him everything? Will I still not hold anything back? That's a good question. And I have to answer that every day, and so do you. Sometimes I think about the fact that like how much I love my family and I love my wife and I love my kids, and I would lay down my very life for them in a heartbeat. If somebody came into my house and put a gun to my head and said, "You or them," I would say, "Pull the trigger." No questions asked. I would lay down my life for any of these people. I love them with everything. But if I think about the fact that because they mean that much to me, that I would lay down my life for them, if I was at a bedside in a hospital somewhere, pleading with God for their life, pleading for God for them to get up out of that hospital bed and come home, what kind of faith, what level of faith do I have to go before God and say, God, I want you to heal them, Lord, please. Please, God, don't let this be. Don't let this sickness win, Lord. Will you please take away this pain? Will you take away this sickness? Will you take away this season? God, please. But at that moment and faced in that situation, and there are not that many situations that bring you to that type of crossroads with your relation with God, except in extreme situations like that, where you say, God, I will do anything if you will grant me this. But even if you don't, even if my family member dies, even if I don't get what I believe you want for me, even if you don't rescue me out of this situation, I'm still going to serve you for the rest of my life. No questions asked. There is no negotiation. There is no compromise. I trust you, God, no matter what. No conditions. No, I'll serve you up until this. I mean, that if I'm being completely honest, I would have questions about God if something like that happened. We would have to have a conversation. Let's just put it that way. But even with that, my heart is to have complete surrender and allegiance to God, no matter what. To not have these unwritten or unspoken conditions between me and God. I'll give you everything that I have as long as you don't touch them, as long as they're healthy, as long as they're strong, as long as they're not sick, as long as they don't have any incurable diseases. We're going to be okay. I'll serve you. I'll give you everything. I'll preach for you whenever there's a microphone and I have an invitation. I'll preach my heart out. I will share my relationship and my love for you. But if you take my kids, if you did something or you allowed something with my wife, we have to have a conversation. That's the truth. But even underneath that, those real raw emotions, I want to believe that when faced with the unthinkable, that I would still choose to serve God, that I would still choose to trust God, even if He doesn't. Lord, thank you for who you are. Thank you for what you are and what you show us about yourself. Thank you, Lord, that in this situation, in this scripture passage, there was more to learn about you than even Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You are the real star of this story, not them. Yes, they're heroic. Yes, we can learn from them. Yes, they inspire us. Yes, we could learn to be like them and face with the adversities that we have faced in life, Lord. But the real hero of this story is you, the God behind the story, the God behind the curtain, the God that showed up in that furnace when people were faced with the unthinkable. The same God that departed the temple, the same presence that departed the temple showed up in exile, in the wilderness. You were still there, Lord. That's the story behind the story here. That's what we can learn about you here. Even in our mistakes, even in seasons of consequences and punishment or discipline, Lord, you still show up. You will never leave us nor forsake us, Lord. And you didn't leave those men back then. And you're not going to leave us today, Lord. Thank you. Lord, I ask for anybody that's watching this or listening to this that's struggling, if they happen to be in one of those situations, Lord, if they're at a bedside pleading with you, Lord, Lord, will you please empower them with that, even if he doesn't, kind of faith, and just trust you with the outcome, no matter what it is. We can trust you. We choose to trust you, especially in unthinkable seasons. We love you, Lord. Amen.